Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. We have a great clean water conversation on tap for you today. Sorry, we're a little delayed. I promise we will make up for it in terms of the quality of our conversation and our guest. So, Friends of the Everglades was founded in 1969 by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and we launched these clean water conversations a year ago to keep people connected and informed during COVID, knowing they couldn't get to government meetings easily. And even now, as we're opening back up and getting to more meetings, we decided to keep them going because it's just a nice way to make accessible the very complicated, sometimes inaccessible world of Everglades restoration and Florida politics and water policy. And we have so much to talk about in that regard today. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to thank Patagonia, which we are a grantee of. They help make this clean water conversation possible. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce Craig Pittman. Craig Pittman is a native Floridian. He worked for 30 years at the Tampa Bay Times, won many awards for his environmental reporting. I am a longtime fan of Craig's work personally. He's also written 5 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country. And I think we're going to talk about Oh, Florida in terms of water policy today and broader environmental policy, because there's a whole subgenre there. His latest book, published in 2020, is Cattail, The Wild, Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther, which we're also going to talk about in the next hour. And I have to say, Craig, just because it's a really cool title, you were named a Florida literary legend. I don't think too many people can say that. So
I'm glad they added living. Living literary legend.
Yes, living legend, living legend. So thank you so much for joining us, Craig. You're from St. Petersburg, where you live, and we have a lot of statewide and Everglades issues to talk about today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here. Great to be here. And as you know, I've been following a lot of this stuff while writing I write a weekly column for the Florida Phoenix on Florida environmental issues. So even though I'm not with the Times anymore, I'm definitely still interested in what's going on and trying to tell people about it.
Absolutely. We are going to be talking about some of your Florida Phoenix columns in the next hour. And I just have to say, you probably better than any other environmental journalist in the state capture the inanity of Florida's policies, in the sense that so many of our water challenges, our environmental challenges, are predictable, and yet we don't take the action needed to stop them from happening. And I think that's going to be a thread in our conversation today, especially because today is the final day of the legislative session in Tallahassee. So plenty of fodder to discuss in that regard.
The silly season, as my dad used to call it.
It's the final day of silly season, and I guess there's going to be an extended silly season in May, but final day of regular silly season.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I think we'll jump right in and start with the legislative session. So the 60-day session in Tallahassee ended today. Friends of the Everglades was engaged on multiple fronts environmentally. It felt like a lot of defensive work this year. We didn't see any offensive wins environmentally. But I have to start with talking about Piney Point, which of course is the fertilizer plant that became a major disaster not far from where you live, Craig. Mm-hmm. And if we could cue up that slide, here we go. So Piney Point, you wrote about it back in 2003. I believe that was one of your earliest stories and highlighted some of the risks. Can you walk us through what you saw then and what has come to be?
Sure. At that point, the owner of the plant, Mulberry Company, had declared bankruptcy and walked away from that one and from another plant that they owned in Mulberry that had already sent poisonous water cascading into the Alafia River, and it killed pretty much everything in its path for 42 miles. The acidic waste on top of the phosphogypsum stack at Piney Point, it could be held in check as long as the plant was running and they were running the pumps. But once the owner walked away, the pump stopped and it suddenly became a crisis. And so the folks at the Department of Environmental Protection actually gave reporters a tour of the place, talked about what was at stake, what a great risk everyone was facing, that they were worried that the water would lap over the top and spill into Tampa Bay and cause all kinds of problems there. And so their proposal then was they were going to bring in a barge and load millions of gallons of this stuff on board the barge and then take the barge out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico and spray the waste into the air, hoping some of it would evaporate and that the rest would settle into the Gulf, but would be diluted by the vast body of water. And they actually got a permit from the EPA to do that. And so I and two other reporters, Julie Hauserman and Candace Rondo, we decided to do a story that said, how did we get to this crisis point with this place? And so we dug into the history of it. We spent several weeks looking through records in Tampa and Tallahassee, not just Department of Environmental Protection records, but also Mulberry's corporate bankruptcy records, and pieced together this story that said at every turn where the DEP could have stopped this, they didn't. They bent the rules in order to keep the company going, trying to, push further down the line the day of reckoning that they knew was coming, to the point where even other people in the phosphate industry were upset about it and said, this company got all kind of breaks that we don't get. We don't understand why they're special and we're not. And so that was the big 2003 story we did under the big headline that said a $140 million mess, which was at that point what it was estimated would cost to clean up the whole thing. But of course, once that happened, once that crisis point receded, the DEP did not clean up the whole thing and instead okayed a plan by Manatee County to sell that property off to another private company that had plans to make money off of it by providing storage for the port. And once again, ran into problems where the company wasn't financially viable, went out of business, when it declared bankruptcy. And once again, we hit this crisis point. And it's just over and over again, that's been the story of Piney Point. It opened in 1966 and violated environmental rules in 1967. And it's just over and over and over again. It's been a sort of a thorn in the side of Tampa Bay. And while all this is going on, the folks in Tampa Bay had spent billions of dollars cleaning up the bay to the point where seagrass had rebounded to the point where it was matching the extent that it was at in the 1950s. And so that was a big triumph. But it seems like as soon as he got the bay cleaned up, Piney Point would spill over into the bay all over again. It's just a constant problem, and nobody was willing to take the steps to solve it.
So even recognizing all that digging you did back then and you what you saw coming, were you surprised by what we faced just in the past month with the breach and the really imminent danger? Well,
no, because I wrote a column for the Phoenix back in October of last year saying, hey, this is coming up again and somebody needs to do something. And, once again, push it down the road. Hope it doesn't hit a crisis before we can, find some other makeshift solution. And in this case, it didn't wait. And they ran into this crisis, and suddenly it's making international headlines and making Florida look bad one more time.
So now we're in the position articulated in the headline on the screen here. Florida Senate proposes $200 million for Piney Point cleanup, and it looks like this money is going to come from federal COVID relief money. What's your read on that?
That's totally legal.
Still taxpayer money.
Yes.
Do you think that will be adequate to solve this once and for all, or is this going to be a long-term issue?
First, I just have to joke that I think Piney Point is a pre-existing condition. So I don't know if COVID relief should apply here. But the Manatee County has a plan that they say DEP is okay with. DEP hasn't officially signed off on it yet, to take all that acidic waste, which has heavy metals in it and other things, and use deep well injection to basically get it out of sight, get it out of the area where it's now threatening Tampa Bay, and instead stick it down underground where it can threaten the aquifer instead, because that's a huge improvement, right? Last time they brought up this idea, which was in 2013, a lot of local farmers objected and said, wait. I know you're saying you're putting it in the salty part of the aquifer where it won't impact our freshwater aquifer, but those things have been known to travel. They've been known to move around. That's happened. It's been documented. and we're worried that you're going to put at risk our ability to irrigate our crops. And they were successful in getting Manatee County to withdraw its permit application then. So they're coming back at it now. I don't know what makes this proposal different from the one in 2013. It looks identical to me, but they're pushing forward with it and saying, well, we think this is the cure. So I did a column about this for the Phoenix, suggesting that, injecting toxic waste into the aquifer is a great way to give us all superpowers, right? So, so we shall be happy about that, because I'm looking forward to having laser vision and flying. I don't know about you. And the thing that has a lot of environmental groups concerned about this is if this is approved for Piney Point, will this become a precedent to allow it to happen at the other 24 phosphogypsum stacks in Florida, where they've got a similar problem? They've got these big stacks with acidic waste on top. What happens if they're ready to shut down that phosphate plant, and they no longer need that water? What do they do with it? And injecting into the aquifer seems risky, I think is the right word. That's actually the word that the Manatee County administrator used when I interviewed him about it.
Is there a better solution at this late stage in the game?
There are ways to treat that waste and dispose of it via the sewer plants, but it's really expensive and very, very slow and time consuming. Or I guess you could load it on a barge and spray it in the Gulf. I mean, there's precedent for that, but that was pretty expensive as well.
The alternatives are not appealing. And before we move on from Piney Point, I have to ask you how Tampa Bay is looking, if you're seeing any signs of what has leaked into the bay, creating algae blooms or worse.
The last monitoring report I saw, which was yesterday, said that they are seeing an algae bloom, but it doesn't appear to be red tide, and they're not sure if it's a harmful algae bloom. Some algae blooms don't really have the same impact that the harmful ones do. But there is an existing red tide algae bloom that's going on. It's been going on since December. It's slowly been creeping up the coast. It started in Collier County. It's moved up through Collier. It started in Collier County, moved up through Charlotte, Sarasota. It's now up around Anna Maria Island. And the concern is that it's going to get into Tampa Bay and suck up a lot of fuel from the Piney Point waste and be with us for a lot longer than it should be.
Got it. Well, we'll stay tuned for news on that. And it's actually a very good segue to our next topic of conversation, which is harmful algal blooms.
Oh, yeah.
This is the view from the Pahokee Marina right now, where DEP tested algae, the blue-green algae you see there, just this past week, and found that there were the level of microsystem in the blooms was more than 100 times what the World Health Organization deems hazardous to touch, to come into contact with. So it's April. We typically don't see these kinds of images in Florida until midsummer months. And this is inside Lake Okeechobee, the marina is. So it's potentially moving to the east and west coasts. And we're very concerned about a repeat of the 2018, 2016, and the toxic algae blooms we saw around the peninsula really that year. So this does relate to the legislature, of course. And there was a bill, a pair of bills actually, this session that would have required the state to take action on the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, which you might recall was created after Governor DeSantis took office. Some good scientific minds on that task force. They came up with a series of recommendations in a consensus document in 2019, and very few of them have been acted upon. None of them have been acted upon in an aggressive way that would change this reality that we're looking at, this very ugly reality. So, Craig,
wait, you're saying they didn't do anything, and so now we're seeing the same problem over again? I'm shocked. Shocked to hear that this has occurred.
Your humor is so useful, Craig, because otherwise it's just depressing enough to just get under the covers and never come out. And humor is necessary. So where do we go from here? Have you followed the Blue-Green Algae Task Force? There's actually a new chief science officer in the state now that will lead that task force. And I am hearing good things about him. Where do you think we should head from here?
Well, I think I suggested in my most recent column that if you see your state legislator bopping down the street like Peter Parker in Spider-Man 3, you should stop him or her and say, why do you prefer toxic algae blooms over healthy people and waterfront economies? Because that's the way they've been acting, is they've been acting like, oh, we can't possibly do anything that would offend all the people who are causing the fuel to these algae blooms to continue to fuel the algae blooms. So therefore, we have to, pretend we've done something and then, ignore it. But that's the thing is, I guess in some ways, this is the biggest disappointment of Governor DeSantis's administration, in that here was a guy who, while running for office, said, I'm going to do something about this. He appointed a really good committee, a committee of scientists, well-respected scientists, to come up with proposals, and they did, and they came up with some very good proposals for how to fix this. And the rate of the legislature did not exactly rush to implement these proposals, and neither did the governor. You can't get a comment from his office about what's going on right now, other than, well, look, we passed this act, this Clean Waterways Act. But as you know, and as I know, the Clean Waterways part of it is more of an aspirational goal than an actual description of what it's going to accomplish. It's all still kind of voluntary and doesn't really do the job. And so, how many more summers of slime do we have to suffer through before the politicians realize, oh, wait, we just pretended to do something about it. I guess we need to actually do something about it.
Right. The human health aspects are so alarming.
Yeah.
So we know that microcystin is linked to liver disease, non-alcoholic liver disease. And there was a cluster of non-alcoholic liver disease near the St. Lucie River identified by Ohio State University researchers several years ago. And then we also know that another toxin in blue reed algae is linked to neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. So this is a full-blown public health crisis. Yet we still don't even have adequate signage warning people where these blooms tend to occur. So a lot more work needed to be done. I don't think I closed the loop on those bills that were filed early this session. They went nowhere. They died. So that's the end of that story.
Yeah. I guess we shouldn't be surprised, given how our governor and legislature have handled the other big health crisis going on in Florida. We have one member of the legislature who's been running around suing local governments for requiring people to wear masks. It's almost as if they see this as, we can get money from the federal government to plug up holes in our budget. Otherwise, we don't care about coronavirus. So
no shortage of fronts in the world of inanity. And we should talk a little bit about what causes these algae blooms. So it's nutrient pollution, and it's also the way Lake Okeechobee is managed. It's kept too high during the dry months, and that allows it to become way too high during the wet months, which is what leads to the discharges east and west. And why does that lake management occur? It's because it benefits the hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane fields south of the lake that rely on the lake as a sort of reservoir for their irrigation and don't want the water to flood their fields when the water's not needed during the wet season. So in a nutshell, that's it. And the nutrient pollution, we know, is overwhelmingly from agricultural sources.
There you go.
That's it. So you mentioned the Clean Waterways Act and the name of it not exactly reflecting what it accomplished. And that bill was passed a year ago in 2020. So let's talk about another bill that has a name that doesn't exactly reflect what it did. So there was, it was actually called Farming Operations, Senate Bill 88, but it essentially overhauled the quote unquote right to farm bill this session. And Friends of the Everglades actually spent a lot of time working on this issue this week. We had major concerns about the sweeping protections this bill gives to farmers, including sugarcane growers who burn their fields, as you see in this picture, and cause smoke and ash to rain down on communities, especially communities south of Lake Okeechobee that don't get the same protections as wealthier coastal communities in terms of when burns are allowed to occur and which direction the wind is blowing. So despite our best efforts, and many of you watching helped with that, 1,500 people sent veto requests to the governor in just over 24 hours this week. And he signed it. He signed it with fanfare this week. And we were disappointed. And I wanted to get your temperature on that.
Well,
that one,
and who were the people who were with him when he signed it?
Farmers and some folks who are supportive of the sugar industry.
Ah, okay. So none of the people who were complaining about the smoke settling in their communities happened to be there. I'm sure they were all just busy. I'm sure that was the reason they weren't there. This is sort of a pattern with the legislature and it's interesting that DeSantis came into office with a reputation, deserved or not, of not being a friend to Big Sugar. And that helped him beat Adam Putnam in the Republican primary, because Adam Putnam was very definitely a friend of sugar, and DeSantis had opposed sugar and its federal price supports while in Congress, so he was not the candidate that they were spending a lot of money on. But since then, he has proven to be very, very friendly to sugar, and this is sort of the ultimate expression of that, because this bill was very clearly targeted, despite Senate President Wilton Simpson's denials. This is very clearly targeted at blocking any lawsuits against the sugar companies for damage that their burning does. So I think the solution to this would be for the state to spend money to put up some big fans around the cane fields and blow that smoke towards Palm Beach instead of towards the communities nearby. And that way, finally, maybe people will care about it, because certain very wealthy people in Palm Beach might start coughing and having respiratory problems.
Big fans might not be any less ridiculous than anything else we're seeing. I should mention this story that's up on the screen now by Lulu Ramadan of the Palm Beach Post. It was on their front page earlier this week before the bill was signed. It's an excellent dive into the language of this bill. It actually mirrors some bill language in a similar right to farm bill in North Carolina that also removed protections from underprivileged communities. So there's an alarming trend here, and there were already protections on the books for farmers in Florida. Many. There are layers upon layers of protections. Yeah. And this really was an affront. And for the reasons you mentioned, Craig, we were hopeful that DeSantis would veto this bill. He was critical of sugar on the campaign trail, very openly so. And that was encouraging and really a first for a governor of Florida to be so vocally critical. But it did not translate into a veto of this bill. So we'll continue to work. There's a Stop the Burn campaign that's active in the Glades community, and local residents there will continue to work on that.
Speaking of gubernatorial candidates, has Agriculture Commissioner Nikki Fried taken a position on this?
She has not, that I've seen, taken a position. Well, let me back up. On the veto, I don't know. But Friends of the Everglades has met with Commissioner Nikki Fried's staff multiple times on this topic, and they point to these new burn regulations that they've put in place since she took office a couple of years ago. They're not adequate because we're still seeing the same effects. So it's not just DeSantis that needs to have his feet held to the fire on this, so to speak. I'm sorry, that was a really bad pun. It's also Nikki Fried, and we'll continue to push on that.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. That's the amazing thing, is that sugar has so much money to spend that it's not just one party that they often control; it's two, and we've seen that over and over and over again. And even people who say they're big champions of the Everglades, when sugar says jump, they say how high.
Well, once again, you've teed up a perfect segue, because our next topic relates to something that farming interests, including sugar, have supported, and it is ASR wells, i.e. water storage north of Lake Okeechobee. So I know this is a really kind of complicated map to look at, so I'll try to distill it.
The lake's the blue part, right?
That's the lake. Yeah. The lake,
okay.
We can simplify that. One of the top priorities, in addition to the right to farm bill of Florida Senate President Wilton Simpson, was ASR wells, aquifer storage and recovery wells, which are part of the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project, which you see at the top here. And the circles that there, the red, are ASR well clusters. And these wells 80 of them are proposed right now, which is actually scaled way back from the
Yeah, it used to be
original
300.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just as you were mentioning, with regard to the Piney Point water being shunted underground, there are a lot of concerns about the impacts of pushing this water underground. If it's dirty, if it's not, the expense of cleaning it before you do. And this was positioned as being a benefit to the east and west estuaries. I think I can use my pointer here. There's the C-44 canal that connects to the St. Lucie, and then down here is where you head to the Caloosahatchee River. And the argument, at least, was that if you push more lake water underground, then you can avoid sending water east and west. But what we found is that the volumes required to avoid east and west discharges are so great that even if you ran these 80 wells 24 hours a day, it would not preclude discharges during the rainiest years in Florida, and the rainiest years are the ones that are most problematic.
Well, and with climate change, we're going to see those increase.
Yeah, exactly. Say more about that. Have you been looking into that?
Well, I mean, I just know from the reports that the federal government has put out on I think about a 3-year or 5-year basis, that they have pointed out that Florida is basically the state most vulnerable to climate change, not just because of the rising sea levels around us, but also because of other impacts from rising heat, where our heat doesn't even dissipate at night anymore now. It still stays hot even when the sun is down. Increased precipitation, increased rainfall, and an increase in algae blooms is supposed to be one of the other aspects coming from climate change. So there's a lot to deal with. And of course, an increase in mosquito-borne diseases, which is fueled by the increased rainfall.
Right. Great point. So this was another hot topic during the legislative session, sailing to approval. So the impact of the state legislation is to accelerate this project, which is actually within the comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, the huge suite of 68 projects that we'll be talking more about in a little bit. But this state legislation asks the Army Corps and federal government to accelerate its authorization, approval, and construction of these wells, kind of jumps them ahead in the line. And I guess to boil it down, for Friends of the Everglades, we just don't think aquifer storage and recovery wells are truly Everglades restoration. And maybe that's just a symptom of the SERP plan trying to give something to everyone 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So
and I know at one point, and forgive me if I'm outdated with this information, but at one point the ASR wells were off the table for the plan because there was a concern that about the chemical reaction underground of putting that water down there, that it would actually lead to chemical reactions with the surrounding geology that would end up putting unacceptable levels of arsenic into the water. Now, I don't know what happened with that. I don't know what changed that they were able to put the ASR wells back into the plan, but here we are.
Right. The National Academy of Sciences identified those concerns, and they're not completely resolved. It feels like a never-ending study. I mean, you can always gather more research, right? Never-ending series of studies, I guess.
Yeah.
But you're never going to have conclusive proof that these are either harmful or beneficial, right? But we have some proof that they could be harmful, which is alarming. And really, maybe I'm jumping ahead because I know we're going to talk about Everglades restoration, but the most successful parts of Everglades restoration to date have been where we can mimic nature, and the stormwater treatment areas, right? Those are marshes that look like nature, and they're successful, and we need more of them. They're overworked. And this is about as far as you can get from nature right here. All right. So moving on, this is a topic that I think you'll have plenty to say about, Craig. The MCOR's toll roads. This, I don't know if we want to call it a success. We're better off than where we were a year ago. So the MCOR,
you can claim victory on that.
mild, I think. So the MCOR's toll roads, there were supposed to be these 3 corridors you see in these blocks on the map. And a Senate bill led by Gail Harrell from Stewart repealed MCORs. It was approved, But what it kept was funding for this Northern Turnpike connector. So this is almost certainly going to be built still. It just won't be part of MCORS, and some other improvements on US 19. So we still have some concerns about these roads getting put ahead of the pipeline, or put to the head of the line. But what I want to ask you is about Panther habitat, and if this Southwest corridor had been allowed to continue, and thank God
it would have been a disaster. It would have been a disaster for panthers. It really would have. And my former paper, The Times, actually obtained a memo from a federal biologist saying basically this would doom panthers, that it would wipe out so much habitat and open up more panther habitat for urban sprawl type development, that it would basically be enough to push them back to teetering on the edge of extinction. They're doing better now than they were 20 years ago, and this would have just been a disaster. So seeing this repealed, albeit not because of environmental impacts, but because of the expense, this is good news for anyone who likes the fact that our state animal is the Florida panther. So we might actually have them around for a little while longer, albeit there's still more panther license plates than there are actual panthers in Florida.
Ironic. Some of the folks involved in the No Roads to Ruin coalition, which we're a member of, Friends of the Everglades, are concerned that as panther territory appears to be spreading north, they've been spotted north of the Caloosahatchee River now, which is great, that even development up here could be dangerous. What's your read on that?
Well, I think that's true. And so I did a column recently. Shannon Estenas, a longtime Everglades activist, was recently appointed by the Biden administration as the new Assistant Secretary for Parks, Wildlife, and some other third thing. Is it fish? I can't remember.
Sounds right.
And so I wrote a column congratulating her, but also saying, here's a list of things you need to take care of. And one of them was, you need to have the Fish and Wildlife Service finally declare what constitutes critical habitat for the panther. That's never been done, because panthers were put on the endangered species list before that was a requirement in federal law. So, a new species comes up, it's declared endangered. Fish and Wildlife Service automatically has to say, and here's the land that they need in order to continue their existence. So this is land we need to take care of. They never did that for the panther. And as a result, the Fish and Wildlife Service has repeatedly okayed development in panther habitat and said, well, it must be okay because we don't have any critical habitat, which is, it's circular reasoning, and it's kind of insulting, frankly. And so I said, you need to tell, they actually had scientists come together and draw up what they thought critical habitat should be for the panther, and then never published the study and tried to bury the whole thing. Well, they've got it. They know where the primary panther habitat is. They know where the areas are where panthers could expand to. They need to declare that to be critical habitat. It won't prevent development in those areas, but it will make it harder and subject it to much more scrutiny. And that's what's needed at this point for panthers.
Right. I want to pause and add that anyone who's watching us live can put questions in the Facebook comments, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can put them in the YouTube comments. And we're going to spend the last 15 minutes with Craig taking your Q&A. So please add any questions you have for him. And I want to continue this discussion about panthers, Craig, because you wrote a really excellent book about them.
You've got the paperback cover. That's nice. I like the paperback. That comes out next Tuesday.
Great. I did grab this one because I just love that image of the panther. It's so vivid and captivating. And I was hoping you'd spend a few minutes walking us through this latest book of yours, the most surprising findings, what it told you about where the species is headed in terms of its future survival.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a story I wanted to tell for about 25 years. And, because every time I would write a story about attempts to save the panther, I think, man, this would make a great book because it's got fascinating characters. Some offbeat things happen. The plot takes all kinds of twists and turns you don't expect, but it didn't have an ending. And you can't write a book if you don't know what the ending is. Well, and then about 4 years ago, I finally got, I wouldn't say a happy ending, but a hopeful ending. So I said, okay, now I can sit down and write the proposal for this book, and sent it out to several publishers. And most of them said, we don't think anybody wants to read a book about Florida panthers. But one publisher said, no, this is a great story. And number one, and number two, everybody loves cats. So they went ahead and published it. The book starts out with a prologue where a panther is being pursued by dogs and by scientists who want to change out the battery in its radio collar, and it winds up dying and ultimately becomes the most important panther in the history of panthers, because that leads to bringing in a veterinarian to go out with the capture team from then on. And she discovers that the panthers are all suffering from genetic defects because there's so few of them left. In 1995, they estimate that there were maybe 30 of them left, maybe even fewer than that. And the population was so small, they were suffering from genetic problems, serious genetic problems. And everything they tried to fix that led to disaster. So ultimately, they had to pull together this unprecedented scientific experiment that they didn't know if it would work or not. And while all this was going on, the Fish and Wildlife Service was continuing to approve constant development in panther habitat. The last time they tried to stop any development in panther habitat was 1993. And otherwise, they were just signing off on everything and saying, oh, don't see any problem with this, don't see any problem with that, don't see any problem with this other thing, never looking at the cumulative impact of all this development on panther habitat. The biggest one that had the biggest impact, I think, was Florida Gulf Coast University, which was approved in panther habitat. And they had actually tracked a panther across the property, so they could prove that not only is it good panther habitat, the panthers are using it, but the property had been donated to the state by Ben Hill Griffin III, a major figure in Florida agriculture. And Ben Hill said, "Oh, there ain't no panthers out there, and panthers are gone; they're extinct." And when there were objections raised by the Fish and Wildlife Service to building this out there, he used his political connections with Bob Graham to get upper level Fish and Wildlife Service people in Atlanta to step in and overrule the folks in Vero Beach and allow it to go through. And his plan, and it's a very successful plan, was he would donate the land for the campus, and then he would develop all the land around it and sell that and make a lot of money off of it. And ironically, the entrance to Florida Gulf Coast University is Ben Hill Griffin III Parkway. So there you go.
More sad irony. I'm going to pull the last image back up because all these little dots, I didn't say it. These are data points where telemetry collars have indicated panthers exist. So I think the area you're talking about is somewhere around here. Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in the book. I started off writing the book because I've been covering panther issues for 20 years. I thought I already know the whole story. I'll do a few supplemental interviews. And I had actually done a big project in 2010 about the efforts to save the panther and how it had clashed with the wholesale giveaway of panther habitat to developers, so that we ended up with more panthers than ever before, squeezed into a smaller space than ever before. But as I was writing the book, I got to a point where I realized I don't know a major part of this story. I don't know what happened, because what they did was they sent this guy named Roy McBride, who's a master tracker of big cats. They sent him to Texas to capture some Texas cougars and bring them back here to Florida. And I thought, I don't know the details of that. And I don't think anybody has ever talked about that. So I called Roy, who's this very he's a character. He's a very reticent guy. He doesn't like to talk. He doesn't like to talk, period. And he doesn't like to talk about himself, most of all. One of his coworkers told me he went 2 years without realizing Roy has a master's degree in biology. He looks like just a guy in a white cowboy hat. He's a slow-talking Texan who spends more time with his dogs than he does with people. But Roy's a really smart guy and actually a really good writer. And I called Roy up, had to let the phone ring about 12 times before we got to it, and told him what I was after. And he was like, I don't know. And I said, well, look, Roy, it's not trying to make you into a big deal. It's that you're a witness. You saw things that nobody else saw. And if I don't get your story, then my story will not be a complete one. And he said, okay. So then he told me the story about how he went out to get the cougars. And That chapter is sort of the low point in the book as far as the future of the panther, but it's also the funniest because Roy's story had me on the floor laughing. I'm just going to say it involves a blindfolded mule and let it go at that.
Good teaser.
Yeah.
I mean, I've just started the book last night, and the prologue is just a beautiful storytelling, and I'm so glad you landed on this story. And so the cougars came from Texas, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to give too much away.
Okay.
And this, by the way, this is the hardback. It's still out there for sale.
Okay.
I always like to point out how the Panthers doing an eye roll at my name on the cover of the hardback. They couldn't do captive breeding. They were unable to do some other things. So finally they said, well, we don't know if this will work, but we'll bring in a close cousin of the panther from Texas and see if that will somehow resolve things. And I mean, there's a lot more going on than just that. There's women scientists battling their male colleagues and their male superiors to get heard because they figured out what's going on. There's a biologist who was leading the panther program and was a big hero. And then he jumped sides and started working for developers. And his first big project was Florida Gulf Coast University. There's a whistleblower who sued the Fish and Wildlife Service to make them stop using junk science to approve all of these new developments. I mean, there's like I said, there's a lot of twists and turns in the plot. And the prologue, I forgot to mention where the panther is dying. They actually had 2 biologists who tried to give it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation before it died, which honestly is a level of commitment to the job you seldom see in America these days.
Yes. That is such a vivid part of the story. And one other thing that jumped out at me in the prologue, I have it here, is you point out that some people claim that the return of wolves to Yellowstone National Park is the greatest conservation victory in U.S. history. Compared with what it took to reel panthers back from oblivion, though, I don't think so, is what you wrote.
Yeah, I mean, it really is an incredible story when you read it all in one place and you go, wow, the stuff they went through and just the human toll that it took on this sort of ragtag band that saved panthers is just amazing to contemplate. And you know, their future's not assured. They're doing better now than they were. There's roughly 200 of them now. They're not out of the woods, pardon the pun, but they're doing better. And just getting to that point with this very charismatic animal that is our state animal, you have to wonder about all the other endangered species that don't have those advantages. They're not seen as sort of this politically important creature. They're just, maybe they're even ugly. Mm-hmm. And who wants to save an ugly creature, even though it's important to the continued existence of a particular landscape?
Thank you for that. And I highly recommend the book. I look forward to finishing it myself. I want to talk about another license plate animal in Florida that is under fire and is having a really bad year. The manatee. Yeah. You actually wrote a book about manatees 11 years ago.
Manatee Insanity. People love that title. It came from a t-shirt. It came from a t-shirt. Somebody was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Stop the Manatee Insanity." And I thought that would make a good title someday.
and the subtitle is "Inside the War Over Florida's Most Endangered Species." So when you wrote the book,
most famous endangered species.
Most famous. Okay,
yes.
Most famous endangered species. Got it. And when you published the book in 2010, it was in fact listed as endangered, but that's changed. In 2017, FWS downlisted it to threatened. Yeah. And wanted to get your read on that and what we're seeing this year. There's an unusual mortality event going on in Florida. 674 manatees as of mid-April, at least. That number might be higher right now.
I think they've hit 700, which is more than they had in all of last year. It's just it's a disaster.
It is. Yeah. What do you think's going on here?
Well, it's complicated by the fact that because of COVID, the state has not been going out and collecting every carcass for a necropsy the way they would usually do.
Right.
So they've been sampling. I think they're doing like every 10th carcass or something. And so, but what they found is an awful lot of the ones, especially in the Indian River Lagoon, are malnourished. And that's because they're not getting the seagrass that they need to eat in order to grow and maintain their their metabolism. And the lost seagrass is due to algae blooms. So we're back to, it's a circle. We're back to algae blooms again, and pollution that fuels the algae blooms. The decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service to downlist manatees from endangered to threatened, it was controversial at the time. A majority of the thousands and thousands of public comments on this said, don't do this. They had a public hearing in Orlando, one public hearing, and a majority of the people who showed up for the public hearing said, don't do this. Scientists that they sent it out to review, people who were, experts on marine mammals, said, we think this is a bad idea. But the Fish and Wildlife Service did it anyway. And they did it in a way that they'd never done before with an endangered species. Usually, if you downlist a species, it's because the threats that they faced have been in some way, made better, that things aren't as dangerous for them as they used to be. Well, the threats that got manatees put on the endangered list in the first place were being hit by boats and the loss of waterfront habitat. Well, guess what? Those are still problems. And in fact, more and more manatees are getting hit by boats every year. The number just kept going up. And so they couldn't take them off the list because of that. So instead, what they did was they used a computer model that made a whole bunch of assumptions about the future of manatees and decreed that the risk of them ever going extinct was way, way low. That they would suffer problems, but they would not go extinct. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service said, well, if they're never going to go extinct, then we can't call them endangered, and therefore we're going to list them only as threatened. It's once again, it's sort of circular logic. And so this massive die-off now has sort of shown what a foolish decision that was. And I wrote a column saying that said, basically, it's time for the Fish and Wildlife Service to admit that they made a hasty decision and a wrong decision and put them back on the endangered list, because the scientists I've talked to have said, you think the die-off is bad this year, next year could be even worse because the seagrass is not coming back right now.
Right. Yeah. And in the places we are seeing it come back in just early stages, like the St. Lucie estuary, if we get dumped on by Lake Okeechobee discharges this summer, that's all going to be wiped out. So really a precarious situation with manatees. And the thing is, it's not just it's not just a thing of, oh man, manatees are so cute and cuddly. It's too bad if they die. This is an economically important animal. Citrus County actually has an annual manatee festival to celebrate manatees. Lots of tourists who come here want to see manatees. It's part of the Florida experience. And if the manatees are dead, then they're not going to like what they're seeing out there, and that's going to hurt tourism. The one in this picture, by the way, is a juvenile that was exposed to brevetoxin, red tide. So not a good situation. Yeah, so definitely. We have only about 13 minutes left, and I know we were going to talk about Everglades Restoration 20 years later, but I'm going to attempt to really...
No, that's a brief conversation. 20 years in, out of 68 projects, they've completed one, and that one is a lab for dealing with invasive bugs and invasive plants. So it's hard to say that they've made a lot of progress.
And I will only add that the price tag has doubled to $16 billion, and we still have the same water quality issues, actually worse water quality issues than we were facing 20 years ago. So,
but people are getting paid, so what's the problem? Contractors are making money.
Yeah. All right. Some might say we're too cynical, and we'll let the questioners call us out on that. So Allie is behind the scenes. Allie is our Director of Communications at Friends of the Everglades. She's looking at questions for us. If you have one, please pop it into the comments, and we're going to tackle as many as we can in these last few minutes here. So here's a question from Michael McGrath. Craig, in your opinion, what are some of the other most serious development threats that panthers and all of the other species that fall under their habitat umbrella face that folks might not be aware of? Okay.
First of all, Mike, I love your profile photo. Second, the biggest threat they face right now is the people for whom Collier County is named have proposed a new town in the middle of Panther Habitat. They're calling it the town of Big Cypress, which is ironic because Big Cypress at one point was sort of the last stand for Panther Habitat in Florida, the Big Cypress Preserve, where they wanted to build the infamous Everglades jetport that got Marjorie Stoneman Douglas turned her into from an author to an activist.
That's why Friends of the Everglades was founded. Exactly.
Exactly. They're calling it the town of Big Cypress. They've got local approval for their project. They're awaiting federal approval from the Fish and Wildlife Service, which, as I mentioned, has not turned down a project since 1993. And the wetlands permits that they need because of something that the EPA did in the waning days of the Trump administration is now no longer up to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's up to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, because the feds handed off responsibility for wetlands permitting to the state, where they shoot out permits about as quickly as long as it takes you to put $1 in the Coke machine and get a soda. So the prospects for that one are not great as far as the Panther's concerned. And I mean, it is literally on land that the Panthers have used. So, the developers are arguing that, we're going to cluster it. And, the area where we're going to build is all farm fields that's not part of Panther Habitat. Well, guess what? The Panthers do cross farm fields. It's an area that, they'll go through that area. So that's the biggest threat that they face. And as you mentioned, they're an umbrella species. So if you protect Panther habitat, you're protecting a whole bunch of other habitat as well.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Do we have another question, Allie? This is from Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch, member of the Water Management District Governing Board. She says, I would like to ask Mr. Pittman what Florida's worst case environmental scenario future could look like, and what its best case scenario could look like. Where does he expect us to be 50 years from now?
Okay, worst case is sprawl everywhere, pavement everywhere. Our award-winning state park system taken over once again by people who were the ones who were in the last gubernatorial administration and thought it would be great to allow hunting and timbering and cattle grazing in the state parks. Oh, and golf. Don't forget golf. They wanted to have golf courses in the state parks. And toxic algae blooms year after year after year washing up on our famous beaches. So much of Florida's economy depends on having a healthy environment. And if you screw up the environment, you screw up the economy. So, if you've got those algae blooms constantly being in the news and being on the beaches and chasing tourists away, that's gonna take a toll on the economy. Same thing with if you screw up the state park system, that's going to take a toll on the economy. Our livelihoods as well as our lives depend on having a healthy environment in Florida. And I think more and more people are starting to realize that because of the summer of slime we went through in 2018, because of the oil spill, the BP oil spill that put oil on the beaches in the Panhandle across 8 counties. People are starting to realize that. But the problem we constantly have in Florida is that we have 900 new people a day moving in, and they don't know this stuff. They don't know any of the background, and their baseline is the way things look the day they set foot in Florida, not the way things were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so for those of us who have been here for a while, it's up to us to try and educate them and teach them, look, things used to be great. We got people in charge who don't understand that. They're more intent on collecting campaign contributions and staying in power than they are about actually benefiting our state. A best case scenario for me, I think, as far as I'm concerned, would be to bring back the Florida Department of Community Affairs, because it wasn't perfect, but it was the agency that was in charge of making sure that their new growth could not occur unless there was concurrent facilities to accommodate that growth. So in other words, you couldn't build if you didn't have roads already up to speed that would do that. Pardon the pun, up to speed. You couldn't build if you didn't have water for the people to drink, or if you didn't have sewage lines for them to use that worked. So once the Rick Scott administration and the legislature at the time got rid of the Department of Community Affairs, basically that meant that our growth management agency, the agency that controlled where growth occurs, is the Florida DOT. And that's not a good situation. And we're seeing the results of that now.
Do you have a best case scenario in terms of water quality?
Actually enforcing the rules that make water quality better, not relying on voluntary efforts like best management practices, but actually, making people do things. I compare it to the speed limit on the highway. If you want people to stop speeding, you don't say, please stop speeding. It's a good thing to do. Instead, you actually put up a sign that says, here's the limit, and then you have cops out there enforcing it. Why we don't do that with our water quality, I don't know.
Right. A fraction of the farms enrolled in best management practices are actually inspected. So we agree 100%. Next question. Did Shannon Estenos acknowledge her to-do list? So background on this, Craig wrote a column a few weeks ago maybe, asking Shannon Estenos to tackle his to-do list. She's the new Department of Interior higher up that he mentioned earlier. She
acknowledged that she'd seen it. Let's put it that way. She sent me a smiley emoji. That was it.
And you mentioned the Panther territory as one of your to-dos. Do you remember off the top of your head what the other key to-dos were?
Well, was with the manatees, put them back on the endangered list. Stop oil drilling in Big Cypress. The Collier family, same ones trying to do the town of Big Cypress. They have given permission for a Texas company to go in and do some exploratory drilling, and it's the Big Cypress Preserve. It's hard to call it a preserve if you're along drilling in there. I think that was it. There might have been some. On pythons. On the subject of pythons, I said, focus more on the science than on the stunts. We have Florida Wildlife Commission has these python rodeos. There was a big press conference recently or I guess back in January, where the governor had a python-covered football, and they were trying to tie it in with the Super Bowl. And it's like, those are all just gimmicks. What you need to do is focus on scientific efforts to find ways to thwart python breeding and expansion in the Everglades. And that may include mimicking the python pheromones, doing some other way to attack their reproductive success, things like that. But that's what's going to solve the problem, not paying people to drive around at night and look for one or two a night tops. Good.
Do we have more questions, Ellie? Will we see Panthers range spread out to eastern and northern parts of Florida?
Gosh, I sure hope so. They once ranged over the whole southeastern United States. And that was why it was okay to bring in cougars from Texas, because the theory was before humans took over the landscape, that they already mingled their genes. And so it would be nice if we saw panthers spread back into those historic areas. I have to say, though, that and there's an academic study that found that there is existing panther habitat, places where panthers could live in other states. But when the Florida asked those other states, hey, can we bring you some panthers? They're like, nah, we're good. we don't need any wide-ranging apex predators that are politically, controversial. So if the panther has a future, it's in Florida.
Great. Thanks for the question, Ed Killer. And I think we have time for one or two more if we have them. From Blake Faulkner. Can you address the C-44 reservoir and STAs when they will be ready to operate? We were told it would be 2021. Have you followed that, Craig?
I think anything that you're told in terms of Everglades restoration, add at least 5 years to it, and maybe more. That's just sort of my general rule of thumb.
Gotcha. Yes, it's a glacial pace at times.
Yeah.
Okay. And do we have one more question?
Snails would be saying, hey, you're moving kind of slow.
Sounds like we tackled the questions in our queue. And I just can't thank you enough, Craig, for the levity you bring to these really serious topics, because I honestly think that helps people stay engaged and not get so depressed that they tune out. So thank you for that. And all of the research you've done for decades on Florida's most pressing environmental issues. It's a huge service. So I want to hand it to you to give any final words on all of these topics we've addressed today. Is there a way to tie a bow on it?
I want to point people back to the original Earth Day in 1970, where 1/10 of the American population actually took to the streets to protest pollution. And as a result, we got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by Richard Nixon, of all people. And so the general rule the lesson I take from that is when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And we finally reached the point in Florida where our politicians know they have to at least pay lip service to the idea of caring about the environment. And it would be nice if we saw them actually follow through on that. And I think they won't do it until we kind of grab them by the lapels and shake them a little bit and say, you want to stay in office? This is what you have to do.
I think we started down that road in 2018, and some of us continued down it. But there's going to be an opportunity for more people power in the near term here if we have more green water and other crises. So thank you so much for those words, Craig. We're so grateful that you shared your wisdom and time. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too.
Take care.